The silence arrived first. It was a vacuum of sound that swallowed the vast, comforting noise of the elephant herd, the deep rumbles, the social chatter, the steady rhythm of their colossal passage. Then came the void in the 6-month-old calf, Temba. He was lost in the vast, open space of the reserve, not physically, but emotionally, cut adrift by a loss too large for his small frame to carry. Elephant calves grieve not with tears, but with a deep, paralyzing withdrawal. This is the moment the laws of nature are asked to bend, when the instinctive need for touch, security, and a guardian must find a source where none should exist. This is the profound true story of how one gentle sheep stepped in to save an elephant calf from the perils of a broken heart. Now let's enter their world. If you're already enjoying this story, a quick like and share makes all the difference. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. The place was the Hoedspruit Endangered Species Centre, a lifeline cradled in the vast low veld of South Africa. It is a haven built on the difficult truth that sometimes the wild needs a helping hand to survive the impact of the human world. Temba, the orphan, arrived there after his mother was tragically lost. At 6 months old, an elephant calf is not just dependent on its mother's milk. It is emotionally and physically tethered to the entire herd. Their intricate social structure is their fortress, and Temba had been ripped from its very foundation. His keepers, led by a dedicated team of experts, knew the statistics were stark. Orphaned elephants often suffer from a failure to thrive, a psychosomatic grief that defies veterinary medicine. They simply lose the will to live. For Temba, the first weeks were a silent struggle. He would pace relentlessly, his enormous, vulnerable ears drooping, his small trunk restless and searching for a touch that would never come. Even the dedicated human keepers offering bottles of specialized milk formula could not penetrate the thick wall of loneliness he had constructed around himself. They could provide nourishment, but they could not provide nurture, not in the language an elephant calf understands. The human touch, despite its gentle intention, was an insufficient substitute for the heavy, comforting presence of an adult elephant. He was isolated, a giant baby surrounded by well-meaning strangers, unable to process the bewildering silence where the thunder of his family once resonated. His pacing became a sign of profound psychological distress, a loop of anxiety that threatened to consume him. The keepers observed him closely, their concern deepening with every day he spent isolated in his kraal. They saw the physical symptoms of his failing spirit, a dullness in his eyes, a slowness in his movements. It was clear that without a radical intervention, Temba would soon join the sad ranks of those who succumb to the grief of the wild. The medical team reached a consensus. Temba needed a companion, and he needed one immediately. This companion needed to be constant, soothing, and utterly non-threatening. The keepers faced an unprecedented dilemma. A human keeper could not provide the necessary constant physical reassurance without risking Temba becoming dangerously habituated to people. A wild elephant companion was simply not available. Their minds turned to a seemingly absurd yet strangely perfect candidate, a sheep. They settled on Albert, a full-grown, gentle Pedi sheep from the center's livestock. He was chosen for his exceptionally placid nature and his non-judgmental presence. The logic was rooted in the fundamental need for warmth, contact, and the rhythmic sound of another heart beating nearby. It wasn't about species. It was about presence. They prepared a separate, smaller enclosure next to Temba's kraal, then gently led Albert in. The introduction was tense, a silent bet placed on the overwhelming power of loneliness. Temba, massive and confused, stood on one side of the fence. Albert, small and calmly chewing, stood on the other. This little sheep was the last, best hope against the crushing weight of an elephant's profound sorrow. The fence proved to be the first great hurdle, a symbolic barrier between two entirely different worlds. For the first 48 hours, Temba treated Albert's presence with suspicion and a weary indifference. He would watch the placid sheep with large, uncomprehending eyes pacing his side of the enclosure. Albert, in contrast, simply existed. He ate his hay, moved slowly, and offered a non-reactive stillness that was the opposite of the frantic human energy Temba had grown wary of. This absence of expectation, this quiet acceptance, was the first gentle crack in Temba's wall. The keepers then took the crucial, calculated risk. They removed the dividing fence. The moment of true contact was marked not by a playful nudge, but by a tremor of fear. Temba, massive and physically imposing even as a calf, immediately became nervous around the small sheep. He kept a wide distance, circling the perimeter of the kraal, his trunk held high as if ready to flee. It was Albert who made the first move, a move born not of courage but of bovine simplicity. He walked calmly towards the spot where Temba stood and began to graze. He was simply being a sheep, and that very normalcy was profoundly comforting. Temba watched, his nervous pacing slowing to a hesitant walk. Slowly, tentatively, Temba began to mirror Albert's movements. When Albert rested, Temba would stand nearby. When Albert moved, Temba would follow, always maintaining a small, respectful distance. The breakthrough came during the cool hours of the early morning when the sanctuary was at its most quiet. Temba, exhausted by grief and anxiety, finally surrendered to the sheep's presence. He walked directly up to Albert, and in a gesture of utter, desperate dependence, he laid his head down against the soft, woolly flank of the sheep. This was the unconditional touch Temba needed, a warm, breathing anchor in his desolate world. It was a profound, instinct-defying acceptance. From that morning forward, the two were inseparable, a visual paradox that redefined the concept of family. Albert had become Temba's emotional security blanket, his surrogate mother, and his son's woolly guardian against the solitude. The challenge for the keepers shifted from encouraging connection to managing an unprecedented interspecies dependency. Temba began to flourish physically, his weight increasing steadily, his eyes regaining their spark. But this physical recovery was entirely tethered to Albert. Albert was his world's center, a small, four-legged planet that Temba orbited constantly. They moved together in a strange, compelling tandem, the massive, gray infant and the diminutive, white sheep. When Temba drank his enormous bottles of milk, Albert would stand patiently by his head. When Temba slept, Albert would be nestled between the elephant's massive front legs, the calf's trunk draped gently over the sheep's back. The greatest test came during Temba's necessary outdoor excursions. Keepers had to ensure Temba received crucial exercise and exposure to natural sights and sounds. The problem was that Albert, despite his calm bravery, was fundamentally a livestock animal, unused to the broader, more unpredictable environment of the sanctuary's training paddocks. Every time Temba was let out, Albert had to accompany him, following his gargantuan friend like a shadow. These walks were a high-wire act of management, ensuring the safety of a sheep in an environment meant for giants. Albert at times would lag behind, distracted by a patch of grass or startled by a distant noise. In these moments of separation, Temba's panic would resurface with alarming intensity. He would stop abruptly, his ears fanned wide, and begin to issue a sharp, distressed trumpeting, a sound of sheer, primal loneliness. The fear was not of the open space, but of the sudden absence of his anchor. Keepers had to quickly intervene, calming Temba and gently guiding Albert back into proximity. It was a constant, poignant reminder that the grief was still a sleeping giant within Temba, only held at bay by the warm, steady reality of Albert's woolly presence. This forced dependency proved two things. The bond was profoundly real, and Temba was still highly vulnerable. For Temba to thrive long-term, he needed more than just a constant presence. He needed a foundation of unconditional trust that was literally and emotionally unshakable. The relationship reached its emotional zenith on a late afternoon, months after Albert's introduction. Temba, now significantly larger and more confident, was feeding from his bottle when a noise, a sudden sharp sound from a passing vehicle outside the enclosure, startled Albert. The small sheep reacted instinctively, jumping away and stumbling slightly. The sheep's moment of fear triggered something profound in the elephant. Instead of panicking, Temba's powerful protective instinct, long dormant, finally ignited. He stopped feeding immediately, dropped his bottle, and let out a protective, rumbling bellow, not of fear, but of dominance directed at the perceived threat. Temba, the rescued, grief-stricken calf, was now the guardian. He used his growing body to shield Albert, nudging the small sheep back toward the center of the kraal with his trunk. It was a complete reversal of their initial dynamic. The rescued had become the rescuer. Albert, sensing the elephant's shift in demeanor, calmed instantly, settling down next to the enormous protective shadow his friend cast. This moment, witnessed by the silent, relieved keepers, was the proof they had been waiting for. It wasn't just dependency, it was reciprocity. The unconditional love Albert had provided had finally allowed Temba's natural social instincts to heal and reassert themselves. The presence of the sheep had not simply soothed the elephant's grief, it had rebuilt his core emotional security. The weight of the world, which had been crushing Temba, was lifted by the realization that he too could protect. This was the true peak of their relationship, the moment Temba learned to give the security he had so desperately craved. He was no longer just surviving. He was thriving, rooted by the presence of his unlikely, woolly brother. The story of Temba and Albert is not simply a footnote in a sanctuary's history. It is a profound lesson in the universality of need. Their bond transcends the vast chasm of biology, asking us to question our own rigid definitions of family, comfort, and compassion. For a creature as socially complex as an elephant, the death of a mother is a catastrophic breakdown of their entire world's order. Albert, the quiet, woolly presence, was the chaos management system that instinct had failed to provide. He didn't try to replace the herd. He simply filled the hole of absolute loneliness with constant, non-threatening warmth. Their time together, a vibrant splash of color against the somber background of grief, provided Temba with a secure platform from which to grow. His recovery, both physical and psychological, became a documented case study in the power of interspecies adoption driven by emotional necessity. The sheep became the bridge from trauma to triumph, holding the elephant calf steady until his own innate resilience could take over. Though Temba would eventually grow too large, too powerful, and too instinctively elephant for Albert to safely remain by his side forever, the foundational work was complete. The love of the sheep had healed the heart of the giant. Temba was eventually integrated into a new elephant herd, transition made possible only because Albert had taught him to trust the world again. The memory of their paradox remains, an unforgettable parable reminding us that the greatest acts of nurture often come from the most unlikely sources. The true sanctuary is not a place, but the unconditional love shared between two souls, regardless of their skin or their species. Slowly, deliberately, the focus pulls back from the Great Plains, leaving only the echo of Temba's contented rumble, a sound that was once a trumpet of fear, now a hymn of peace. We are left not with a question of why it happened, but how often we too miss the simple, woolly comforts that could heal our deepest wounds. The sheer weight of an elephant's grief was borne and dissolved by the placid, unassuming constants of a sheep. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps us bring more stories like this to light. We have a question for you. What was the single moment in this story that resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one.